Good evening. Welcome, all of you who are gathering tonight around your devices, your computers or your iPhones or perhaps tablets. So thankful for your presence tonight. I see in the chat all of you popping up saying hi, hello. Again, this is our fifth session of the book by Dr. Tisby, The Color of Compromise. I'm thankful for your participation, for your insight, and for your openness in this discussion and in this format. So thankful that you're joining us tonight. I know it's always some of you are joining live and we'll be chatting. Some of you will be joining a little bit later or watching later at whatever time is convenient for you. So always saying hello to all of you who are watching. So thankful for your commitment and participation. I would like to start tonight with a prayer by Martin Luther King Jr. We will be discussing a little bit about, we will have read about the civil rights movement, and we will have a little bit about Martin Luther King Jr. In our discussion. And so I really would love to open our time together, just centering our hearts and minds, and come to God in this prayer. So if you're able to join me, that is great. And if not, you can just say those things inside your heart. Thou eternal God, out of whose absolute power and infinite intelligence the whole universe has come into being, we humbly confess that we have not loved Thee with our hearts, souls, and minds. And we have not loved our neighbors as Christ loved us. We have all too often lived by our own selfish impulses, rather than by the life of sacrificial love as revealed by Christ. We often give in to order to receive. I'm going to say it again. We often give in order to receive. We love our friends and hate our enemies. We go the first mile but dare not to travel the second. We forgive but dare not to forget. And so as we look within ourselves, we are confronted with the appalling fact that the history of our lives is the history of an eternal revolt against You. But Thou, O God, have mercy upon us. Forgive us for what we could have been, but failed to be. Give us the intelligence to know Your will. Give us the courage to do Your will. Give us the devotion to love Your will. And in the name and Spirit of Jesus we pray. Amen. Amen. I want to begin our discussion by asking you a question: what you have been learning about the complicity of the Christian church with racism. As you begin gathering your thoughts a little bit, I do want to say tonight that we will be talking about, especially in the second part of our session, we will be talking about the some political historical facts, and Dr. Tisby will very eloquently will say to us that we are not convincing you to be part of one or the other party. I think the importance of learning tonight and reading that we have done helps to inform us the actions that we will be putting ahead, especially when we come to those times of elections, right? I think we're all, perhaps maybe you're not, but I was surprised about some of the political activity and action that came from the evangelicals. That was all new for me. I've learned a lot, and so I think perhaps learning all of this tonight and doing a bit of discussion on that informs us in how we're going to act politically, right? When the next election term comes our way, and that's important. So again, we're not saying this political party is good or bad. We're just naming these things to learn and to continue to share in this process of understanding what had happened in the past, how Christians and the Christian church have been complicit, and now how things could have been gone better, and how things can go better now. So just want to tell you this a little bit. And so I've asked you a question: what have you been learning about the complicity of Christian church with racism? And Tim Krebs says, finally here. Well, hi Tim. Hello. Sandy responded, in some cases, the Christian church has actively encouraged racism. Yes. In others, the Christian church has been silent, doing nothing against racism, which is complicit. Yes, Sandy. So, for example, I'm just thinking about what we've read for tonight about the flight to suburbia, right? And the churches and the schools, and our churches actively promoting segregation, right? And racism. That's pretty explicit. But staying silent, or saying nothing against the systems that have been put in place, that's complicit. Yeah. Diane says doing nothing can really be complicity. Yeah, exactly. That's what I'm learning too. So not stating that you are actively anti-racist is complicit. Kathy says some Christians overly justified their racism by quoting the Bible. Others felt that it was not the church's role to directly address racism. Others preach a go slow approach. I like the go slow approach, and I think perhaps that's complicity as well. Then Shelley says, I found the comment, racism is always present, it just changes form. Yes, very enlightening. And racism has become much less overt, but it's still very present. Shelley, this is very good. We're actually going to talk about it, and how that it doesn't feel personal. It doesn't feel overt. Yet we are all participating in the systems, right? As racism adapted, we're participating in the systems that still continue to promote racism. Tim said, it's been making me think about how I have not done things I should have or could have done, and how I can fight complicity today. Yes, Tim, that makes me think about all of these things too. And yet I'm being very slow in trying to understand, okay, what can I do today? What can I do today? I think every time we meet or every time I read, I ask that question, and it's just I'm not quite sure I'm even ready. I feel like I need to continue to learn, to continue to research, to read, and have conversations. But perhaps we'll be ready to act soon, sooner rather than later. That is the hope. Rachel says much of the complicity in racism within the church was not motivated by hatred of our black brothers and sisters, but rather as a means to further their position in society no matter the cost. Right, Rachel. I agree with that too. There is this economic component almost. I think starting from, it's not even, it's economic, but I think there is also comfort. There is just, it's good to be in this place. Why do we need to change that, right? So yeah, it's not overt hatred, but this is what we do. This is what needs to be done. And so yeah, I agree with that. So thank you. Thank you just for these comments to kind of begin our discussion. And so now let's turn to the civil rights movement. And of course, there's a lot of resources on that, right? And what we remember about what Dr. Tisby told us is that we're not looking at history in great detail here. It's a survey. And so, perhaps if you wanted to read more about the civil rights movements, there are many, many millions of resources and sources that we can go to, and including Martin Luther King autobiographies and his writings. But I wanted to ask you a question, actually. If you remember yourself, those times, the mid 60s and some of those acts that came, I just wonder if you remember those years. If you I don't know, I think a lot of you just in different age group, but I wonder if anyone of you remember. And then if you know of a person or persons in your family, maybe pastors or friends, others, who actually marched, who went to marches, or who were active in the movement. I don't know. It's just interesting to see if we have anyone who has that kind of personal connection. And maybe not. I don't know. But it's interesting if you remember and how you remember that, those days and those times. So I'm definitely, I know of a person, of a pastor from my husband's church, who went and marched, but I don't remember which march. I don't know if it was the Freedom March, but that's all I know. I know that it was important for him to go and important for him to support. So let's see. Tim Krebs said, when I was in high school, my pastor Jack Klein marched. Yeah, with them. Okay, this is great, Tim. Yeah, so you have that influence and impact in your life by your pastor who actually went and marched. So he was one of those who were not complicit. He actually risked a lot of things to go to a march. Thank you so much for sharing that. Oh, you said I never talked to him about it. Oh, okay. Well, Tim, if he's alive, maybe you should bring that up. Sandy said, I knew about it, but was at the age to be quite self-absorbed at the time of civil rights movement. But since then, I have met people who participated and marched with others. Thank you. Yes, I assume it was perhaps teenage years, Sandy, when we're a bit more self-absorbed than other times of our lives. So thank you for sharing that. Yes, that you have participated. Larry Brown says, a couple of my white seminary professors joined marches in the South. In the 60s, I was a young child, and the Vietnam War is what I remember as prominent in people's thoughts and words. Oh, that's what you remember, yeah. But it's really cool that the seminary professors went. And so Larry, Sandy, and I think Bev, we all went to a Methodist Theological School in Ohio. So I think some of the professors from that school went. Shelley Eden says, I have a degree in social work. Several of my professors engaged in a number of peaceful protests regarding racial equality. Yeah, that's really cool, Shelley. Thank you for sharing that. I think it's important to bring those people to our minds, that they are around, and they're the testament of those who risked and who went and who were vocal, who were not complicit. And so we give thanks for all those peeps. And if you still want to put a comment in a chat, that's fine. I'll catch that later. So that would be great. Sandy said, one of the white pastors that I served with was a student at MTSO at the time of the Civil Rights Movement. He went south and marched. Yeah, okay, yes, thank you, Sandy. That's great. And then Kathy said, I remember watching images of black nonviolent marches being blasted by water and covering from barking dogs, and a friend's father making more racist comments. Oh, it was upsetting to me. I bet, Kathy. That sounds upsetting. And then you said, I also remember teenagers making derogatory comments about our pastor, who was sympathetic to the plight of black people. Oh, I'm sorry. But you see, Kathy, you had a pastor who was able to speak up from the pulpit, which again, as we've learned, it was very risky. It was looked down upon. And so thank you for sharing that. And then Diane and Larry said, I remember hearing of the marches, but I was one of the self-absorbed ones. Okay, so Diane and Sandy, you were kind of together there. You were friends. Again, thank you so much for lifting up these people who give us hope, who give us hope for what we could be. So thank you. Tim said, at the National YMCA Convention, I with others interrupted the keynote speaker to make the point that black members were not being represented. Yeah, that's incredible, Tim. That takes a lot of courage. So thank you for sharing that. Thank you. All right, friends, we're gonna move on to watch the video. So again, if you have any more comments, put them down. I'll read them after we watch the video. We want to move on to hear Dr. Tisby, and we're going to watch a video, just a little section on chapter 8. So let's turn to Dr. Tisby.
We've all heard the story of the tragic lynching of Emmett Till, right? But let me give you a little background to let you know just the humanity of this young boy. Emmett Till was 14 years old, and he begged his mother, Mamie Till Mobley, to let him go down to Mississippi from Chicago so that he could visit his cousins and get a break from city life. Now, his mother was reluctant, but eventually she relented. Unfortunately, it would be the last time that she saw her son alive. In August 1955, Emmett Till, along with his cousins and some friends, they're joking around and playing outside of Bryant's grocery store in Money, Mississippi. We don't know exactly what happened, but Emmett Till went into the store and was alone with the store proprietor named Carolyn Bryant, and somehow he crossed an invisible line of Jim Crow. He either whistled or flirted with Carolyn Bryant, And when she told her husband about it, he was furious. He got his brother-in-law, and they went and they got Emmett Till from where he was staying with his grandfather, took him out to a secluded place, and proceeded to torture and eventually murder him. As far as Till's body, it was discovered in a river several days later. His ear was sliced, his femur was broken, he had a cracked skull and a bullet hole above his ear. It was a horrifying sight. And yet his mother decided to have an open casket so that the world could see what hatred had done to her baby. Rosa Parks had Emmett Till on her mind when she decided to disobey a white bus driver and keep her seat. Now listen, Rosa Parks was not this silent, passive woman who all of a sudden one day decided not to move on the bus. In fact, she had helped defend Reese Taylor, the black woman who had been gang raped in Alabama. She also had attended, Rosa Parks, the famed Highlander folk school to get training in civil disobedience. So this incident on the bus actually fit into a long history of Rosa Parks's defiance, and that's a story told well by the historian Jean Theoharis. The number of people who spoke prophetically against segregation and racism during the civil rights movement should not be overestimated. The reality, it was a very small minority of Christians who were doing the marches and the boycotts and actively participating in the civil rights movement. And Christian moderates were complicit in racism more often than courageously confronting it. Martin Luther King Jr. writes about this concept of the Christian moderate in his famous Letter from a Birmingham Jail in 1963. So 1963 is an eventful year. That's the same year as the 16th Street Baptist Church bombing. It's the same year as the March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. And in April, on the 12th in 1963, it was Good Friday. MLK was arrested for protesting in Birmingham, and that's when he wrote this famous letter from jail. Birmingham was a very dangerous place. It had earned the nickname Bombingham, and they had this famously segregationist law enforcement officer named Bull Connor who wasn't going to let any outside agitators come in and disrupt the law that he thought should be in place. So in light of this, Martin Luther King told his allies in the Southern Christian Leadership Conference, as they were about to go into Birmingham for this campaign, he said, "I have to tell you that in my judgment, some people sitting here today will not come back alive from this campaign. And I want you to think about it." So King knew he was going to a very dangerous place. He thought his life and those of the people who were with him might also be in danger. Now, we often talk about the letter from a Birmingham jail, but we don't often mention the letter to a Birmingham jail. In other words, the letter to which King was responding when he wrote his own message. This was a letter written by white clergy. They were pastors and there was one Jewish rabbi. What stands out to me about this letter is the reasonableness of it all. Again, these are not the outright foaming at the mouth racists. They said things in this letter like, "We recognize the natural impatience of people who feel that their hopes are slow in being realized. But we're convinced that these demonstrations are unwise and untimely." They go on to say that when rights are consistently denied, a case should be pressed in the courts and in negotiations among local leaders and not in the streets. So what are they saying? They're not saying, look, Martin Luther King and all these civil rights folks, you got it wrong. Things are just fine. Stay out of it. These moderate white clergy members are saying, listen, we get it. Society is unequal based on race, and you should do something about it, but you should do something about it in the courts. You should have patience. You should realize that things are slow to change. And so they're counseling moderation. Sounds all well and good, right? Well, what was King's response? In his letter from a Birmingham jail, he said this: "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in the stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klanner, but the white moderate, who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." Let me say one final word about Martin Luther King Jr. and evangelicals. You see, MLK has become sanitized, or as I often say, he's become the quotable king. We like the pithy phrases and the words about being judged by the color of one's skin and not the content of one's character. And we basically, in our day, have made King out to be less radical than he actually was. In fact, when he died, a majority of American citizens disapproved of him and his tactics in polls that were taken at the time. And we should also remember that King didn't die, he was killed. We often forget how controversial King was to evangelicals while he was alive. So in 1961, King gets invited to the Southern Baptist Theological Seminary. This is the flagship seminary of the Southern Baptist Convention. One historian writes that within the church, this simple invitation was a racial and theological heresy, such that churches across the South rescinded their regular donations to the seminary. When donors heard that King was coming to their white evangelical seminary, they said, "We're taking our money back." Why? Because of King's emphasis on the social dimensions of Christianity. It put him at odds with and angered many white evangelicals of his day. Even Graham advised King in the early 1960s that he should, quote, "put on the brakes with all this civil rights stuff." Graham said the evangelist is not primarily a social reformer, a temperance lecturer, or a moralizer. He is simply a charis, a Greek word for a proclaimer of the good news. Again, this division between social and political. The day that Martin Luther King Jr. was assassinated, he recalls in a book that he could hear voices down the hall of his classmates let out a cheer. Reflecting on his classmates' response, his white classmates' response to the assassination of Martin Luther King Jr., Dolphus Weary said, "Laughing at Dr. King's death was just like laughing at me, or at the millions of other blacks for whom King labored. Not everyone was a virulent racist, but enough people went along with the status quo to make the civil rights movement both necessary and dangerous for those who participated." The American church largely chose to compromise with racism through a passive complicity. And so they rejected yet another opportunity to come alongside Black people in the nation's second Reconstruction, known as the Civil Rights Movement.
And I just realized that I didn't have sound even for that. Again, apologizing for these little things that are happening, losing sound. I just try to do something so that I can follow the video here in my program, but I guess it doesn't work, so I'm not gonna do that anymore. So again, apologize for the loss of the sound, but I hope you still understand the context there at the end. It was a Black student who was very upset when he heard his, I think it was, I don't know if it was a roommates, but students along the hallway were laughing when they heard that Martin Luther King Jr. Died. And so that was the context, and that was the little place that was lost in the video. So again, I apologize. So I know that we have talked about Emmett Till during Lent. I do not know if you remembered when you read the chapter that Pastor Justin shared that story during one of the Lenten sermon series. And we have talked about one of the ways how, of one of the theories, why Jesus died on the cross for us. And so he used that as an example. So I hope you were able to connect with that. But what I really want our discussion to go is, I'm going to show you a quote here. Image 2. This is a quote by Martin Luther King Jr. from his letter from Birmingham jail. And remember that we also read about a few clergy, a white clergy that wrote to Martin Luther King Jr. To kind of calm down. And I'm going to just read what Dr. Tisby said. These clergy, so I'm on page 137. These clergymen likely had good intentions, but they didn't realize that the talking and negotiating for which they advocated had been attempted and had yielded to no progress. They denounced the violence that direct action would supposedly incite, but they did relatively little about the countless lynchings, church bombings, and beatings black people across the nation suffered at the hands of segregation. So, they affirmed the hatred and violence have no sanction in our religious and political traditions, but basically they want to encourage restraint and patience in pursuing civil rights for black people. And so this quote by Martin Luther King, of course, Dr. Tisby said so well. We like to quote Martin Luther King. He is a huge figure for us as Christians. Yet at the time when he was writing these things and when he was preaching, it was very controversial for many Christians. And so I want to read this quote and talk a little bit about this tension. So he said, "I have almost reached the regrettable conclusion that the Negro's great stumbling block in his stride toward freedom is not the white citizen's counselor or the Ku Klux Klaner, but the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice." So for us to understand this, I'm just going to give you this little quote, or trying to understand that sentence, right? So the negative peace is the absence of tension, and the positive peace is the presence of justice. So if you try to kind of get at that, but now I'll go back to the quote, right? So the white moderate who is more devoted to order than to justice, and it is the white moderate who prefers a negative peace, which is the absence of tension, to a positive peace, which is the presence of justice. So what are the examples of negative peace, so-called, right? So-called negative peace in our readings, but also in what we perhaps see in our everyday life now. So that, again, the negative peace, which is the absence of tension, and I think that is what the clergy who wrote that letter, that's what they wanted. They wanted order, the absence of tension. They did not want rioting. They didn't want violence. To them, they were asking for that patience. So what are the examples of that negative peace? In our readings, right, and in our current times, those are examples of complicity in our lives. And now I realize that I asked you that question, and I'm not quite sure I answered that question myself before I prepared. So I'm kind of trying to answer that myself as well. The negative peace, right? The preference of the negative peace. And I think maybe, Rachel, you talked a little bit about that when it is not overt, when we want, well, and I'm just thinking, I guess, let's just go back to 2020 and remember George Floyd's death. And perhaps there were people who would say, well, we do not need riots and protests, and why do we need to talk about it? I remember we were gathering here at the lawn, and I know some people were kind of like, why do we need to talk about it? Why do we need to go against police? Why do we need... So there was all these why, kind of not understanding, but also not saying anything against it, and not being actively going out there and protesting. So perhaps that could be an example. I know it's really hard. Oh, you've got a couple of answers here. Tim said negative peace is the letter to the paper from the Birmingham pastors. Yes, it is. So I guess they were wanting to promote peace that is absence of justice, right? So then Kathy said redlining leading to segregated neighbors, segregated schools. Yes, thank you. And segregated neighborhoods, right? Yes, thank you, Kathy. Sandy said, I can't quite quote specifics, but some of the words and actions of Billy Graham concentrating on evangelism and individual conversion without social justice action. Yeah, I agree, Sandy. Well, and many other preachers who were saying how much it is important that we are focusing on our personal holiness per se, right, and not social action, and not going out there. Well, and with Billy Graham also, he did this grand gesture and grand act on one of his rallies, right, when he pulled out those lines where people were separated, right, whites and blacks, they were separated. And so that was a grand gesture. And then he said that how perhaps the issue of race is the issue of not loving our neighbor, but then he never went further, right? He never went with MLK to the marches, or preached rather powerful sermons against racism, right? So that's very good. I know it's kind of a harder question, but I think that's what complicity is this negative peace, and I think this is just this nice warm place. Why do we need to bother with things, right? Why do we need to be violent? Why do we need to do something about it? How horrible that all the businesses... I'm just remembering what happened in Columbus, the summer of George Floyd death, and I remember all the businesses and people were complaining, right? You've got more answers. Rachel says, discouraging direct action deeming certain topics not appropriate for the church to take a stand. Yes, excusing the actions of others for personal or political gain. Yes, thank you, Rachel. Yes, especially discouraging the church to take a stand. Yeah. Larry said a positive example of negative peace may sometimes be when we say, let's pray about that, and we'll hold that problem in prayer, when we may preferring to say safely distance from the tough issue. Yeah, I think you and Rachel, Larry, you guys are there together. And I think especially when it comes to prayer, when we pray instead of act, or when we pray instead of perhaps more overtly saying where we stand. So it's a really hard place. So thank you. Then Tim says, I remember pastors saying that being a Christian is not a life of comfort. Yes, exactly. So thank you for your answers to this kind of a harder question. I appreciate that, your reflections on that negative piece and what it means. And I think how often we are living in that, and I am. So thank you. And Tim says, if we are comfortable, we need to ask ourselves why. Yes, absolutely. So we need to move on. I think we thank you for your comments. Let's move on and watch the video on chapter 9 and see what other things we need to talk about together. And I'll try not to mess our sound, all right? So let's turn to Dr. Tisby.
Political operative Lee Atwater said he had two great aims in life: to manage a presidential campaign and to be the chairman of his party. He achieved both of those goals by the age of 40. He was a Republican operative who worked on George H.W. Bush's campaign and earlier had worked in the Reagan White House as an advisor. He was known for his shrewd tactics and sometimes brutal political ad campaigns. But he made an admission. Shortly before his untimely death in 1991, because of a brain tumor, he said, "You start out in 1954 saying nigger, nigger, nigger. By 1968, you can't say nigger, that hurts you. It backfires. So you say stuff like forced busing, states' rights, and all that stuff, and you're getting so abstract." Atwater went on to explain, now you're talking about cutting taxes, and all the things you're talking about are totally economic things, and a byproduct of them is black people get hurt worse than whites. What Lee Atwater is encompassing in those statements is the idea of colorblind conservatism. One of the themes as we study U.S. race and racism is that racism never goes away, it just adapts. So in colorblind conservatism, you don't use explicitly race-based language. You claim that you don't see color, so you don't say black or white in the laws. But you still end up supporting social and political policies that adversely harm racial and ethnic minorities. This section, I want to talk about the rise of the so-called religious right. We're covering the period from the 1960s through the 1980s, and it's a time when political conservatives helped coalesce certain Christians into a political force that every major Republican political official had to court if they wanted to have lasting success. Now, neither Democrats nor the GOP adequately address racism. Neither party is free from it, but one party has set itself up as the party for, quote, real Christians and evangelicals. Now, let me say this from the outset. I thought in my experience that talking about racism would be the most controversial thing I could do among evangelicals, but I was wrong. It's talking about politics and racism. And so let me say from the start that this is not about anyone becoming a Democrat or a Republican or switching parties. I think we need faithful Christians in both parties, but we need faithful Christians being Christian where they are, which means calling out the bigotry and racism and prejudice that may arise from whomever or whichever party. Now, when we're talking about the rise of the religious right, politics became a proxy for racial conflict, and that conflict translated into divisions in the church. In the late 20th century, evangelicalism becomes a national movement. So in 1976, a Newsweek article proclaimed it the year of the evangelical. It's about this time that Jimmy Carter becomes the first openly born-again president. It's 1980 that Rick Warren establishes Saddleback Church as one of the first and premier mega churches in the U.S. It's the popularity of Hal Lindsey's book on the end times called The Late Great Planet Earth, which sold 28 million copies. What is an evangelical? Now, historians have spilled plenty of ink trying to tackle this question and define evangelicalism. One frequent reference point, which has its drawbacks but is helpful to start, is called Bebbington's quadrilateral, meaning four sides. The first is conversionism. Evangelicals place an emphasis on a personal decision to follow Jesus. The second is biblicism, which interprets miracles as true and scripture as divinely inspired. It's a supernatural book. The third is crucicentrism, which is a focus on the crucifixion and Christ's sacrifice. And then number 4 is activism, which means an engaged faith, one that doesn't retreat from the world, but somehow speaks to it. Now, there's something called the politicization of evangelicalism, this melding of evangelical Christian beliefs and politics. Historian Kristen Dumais says, it seems reasonable to assume that when Americans self-identify as evangelicals today, many of them are identifying with the movement as it has taken shape in recent decades, a conservative, politicized movement. So we got to probe this connection between evangelicalism and politics. Again, racism never goes away, it just adapts. Racism didn't end with the Civil Rights Movement or with the Civil Rights Act of 1964 or the Fair Housing Act of 1968. 400 years of oppression and white supremacy does not disappear with the stroke of a pen or the passage of just a few years. Now, racism was easier to detect in the past, so this is one of the things that we have to be conscious of. Racism in the 21st century and even at the end of the 20th century, it's more subtle. But still, as subtle as it may be, Christian complicity remains. Law and order rhetoric fueled an increasingly punitive criminal justice system, so that nowadays people talk about the crisis of mass incarceration. Think about this. The U.S. has 5% of the world's population, but 25% of its incarcerated persons. There are harsher sentences. There are undercover police squads that go in and raid inner city communities. There are financial incentives to building prisons. This is all part of what some historians have called the Southern Strategy. The Southern Strategy tapped into an emerging sense of white middle-class suburban identity. The religious right compromised with racism by failing to support civil rights legislation and alternatively by supporting policies that adversely and disproportionately impacted Black people. There are these pernicious ideas in the political about welfare and welfare queens and crime that is focused among Black people. These ideas that lead to issues such as mass incarceration. There's also this issue that capitalism is somehow the only Christian way to think about economics. In fact, Jerry Falwell said in his book, Listen America, the free enterprise system is outlined in the book of Proverbs. Over time, Black people have voted less and less for Republican candidates or their policies, while white evangelical support remains strong. In fact, it's the highest of any religious demographic group. And we've got to probe that. We've got to ask, Why are black and white people generally and black and white Christians in particular voting so differently? What is it about the platforms of each party that appeals so differently to these different groups along racial lines? There are always unintended consequences of our political choices, bad things that happen as a result of things that we did support. We can't completely plan for that, but Christians do have the responsibility to consider how our political allegiances attach themselves and either support or deny racial justice. In particular, we need to look at this marriage between evangelicalism and conservative politics and the ways that particular policies may have, even inadvertently, supported racial inequality.
Thank you, and thankful for Dr. Tisby for his expertise and just a short excerpt on chapter 9. And of course, there's a lot to unpack in that chapter. And I'm going to just offer perhaps maybe one question. I have many questions prepared, and again, as always, time is flying away. So I wonder how you feel about that one. And I think that was, let's see. Race-based language in our country has shifted from explicit slurs to coded language about racial difference. How have you seen racism adapting to the changing world around you? List some of the coded racist language you have heard. And I think to that point, I think what I have learned, and perhaps you have too, or maybe you've known this, is that again and again, Dr. Tisby reminds us that racism adopts and becomes more implicit. It comes more not as a personal action, but more a part of a structure and a part of a system that perhaps does not affect people who are living in suburbia on that regular way. So first of all, we are removed from that reality physically, and then we're removed from that physical act, right, of being racist. We do not have slaves, right? But there are structures and systems like our systems of prisons, and so many people who are incarcerated in our country, right? And there are other ways and structures that it kind of removed that personal attachment, and that's why, and that explanation really helped me, because I think we all feel like, well, we're not spewing out racial slurs here and there, try to be good people, but it is how we accept the systems, which is much bigger than our personal action, right? So, and that's why I feel like I don't even know what we can do to continue just learning, because it is so much bigger, and it is on the level of a system that is put out there. And in these last, let's see, well, what we've looked at 70s, right, the end of the 20th century, those 30 years, they were so formative with the religious right, with the colorblind kind of rhetoric, with evangelicals, and that the turn, all of a sudden the people are political. How is that possible? So how is that? How did that happen, right? All of a sudden we're political. Oh wow. So I thought the churches and the preachers were not supposed to be political. And so I think it's just there were so many ways and things that were put in place. And I watched an incredible documentary about it, and this whole evening, it comes to mind. I will remember the name and I will send it to you. But it gives a better explanation of law and order and a good explanation of the justice system and incarceration. So let me see how you're doing with your examples of race-based language, which I actually did not know. I realized that I don't know. I think in the quote that it was, let me see if I can open that quote. Lee Atwater, I think states' rights, forced busing, I think those were the words. I think, and then I've heard of dog whistle, and I'm still trying to understand what that means. So it's this more implicit language rather than using explicitly the word, the N word. Then Tim says, my white son has better grades, but may not get in the college of choice due to non-whites getting in. Thank you, Tim. My son has better grades, but may not get in college of choice due to non-whites getting in. Okay. Then Shelley says, in the previous Bible study, a black person mentioned that he never walks his dog without having his wallet. He lives in a nice neighborhood and has been stopped by police while walking. Yeah, I understand. Then Diane says, voting rules should be decided in each state. So that's the states' rights. Yeah. So and that's the rhetoric that we hear now as well. So there's that influence of the religious right is still with us. It was also, I think, interesting to hear about and read a little bit about the abortion as well, because that's where we are now. And so it's very interesting that some Protestant or even Baptists were not as strongly against abortion, and they were more flexible on certain cases. So that was very interesting to see how things have shifted and changed. And I think we are definitely more divided, and I think there's this movement of religious right and evangelicals meshed with the Republican political party. It's still here and it's still impacting us, and I think we read about it. But Shelley said, I'm so sorry, he needs his license to show that he lives in the neighborhood. Yes, Shelley, yeah, thank you. Yeah, I understand that he needs to show the proof. So thank you so much. We're of our time. It's 2 minutes. We have a couple of minutes. I wanted to tell you, again, thank you for your participation tonight. For our homework, we will read chapter 10, 11, and conclusion. So I'm just going to let me put that in the chat for you. So I'm going to put that in the chat. And then I also wanted to let you know that we will be doing a listening circle. I know some of you have participated in a listening circle before in this church. And I'm working with Sandy Hubert to help me organize a listening circle so that we are able to come together to, I'd say, debrief and see where the Holy Spirit is moving us. Debrief the whole webcast, the readings, the videos, the discussion. And so for now, we are doing it on August 10th. And I will send all the information to you. You will need to be registered so that we know for sure that you're going to be there. And we want to know for sure so that we are able to recruit facilitators. A listening circle is a very structured way of people coming together and sharing what's on their hearts and their minds, and honoring time, honoring each other. And it's an ancient Native American way of coming together for issues like that. So I will send you all the information about that and invitation. For now, kind of plan on August 10th, and the time is TBD. Let me finish the final comments here, see what you're saying, and we'll say goodbye. So Kathy said, perhaps this comment did not show up before. And Kathy, I don't know what came. Nothing came out. Nothing else came. Lisa said, a black neighbor of ours lets her son go to the party, but not the sleepover part of the party. Yeah. That is still hard. Suzanne says, racial profiling is very dangerous. I talked with a lady who said that she wished she had not had children because of the danger her sons will face when they start driving. Oh, Suzanne. That is so sad. Thank you for sharing that. Again, thank you for your comments tonight. Thank you for being here. Apologize for some of the technical issues with the sound. Again, let's read basically read till the end, and we'll come together for the final session, and then come together again. For those of you who are available, I'll be able to be here. So blessings, my friends. Thank you so much for being here. Good evening. Thank you for your discussion and again, your openness tonight. So I see you next Wednesday. Bye-bye.